What would happen if a massive army of tens of thousands, armed to the teeth with shining armor and razor-sharp weapons, suddenly vanished completely from the face of the earth without leaving a single trace of survivors? Imagine the most horrific scenario. They weren't defeated in a fair fight. They weren't
Hold the line!
taken
Push
as
them
prisoners
back!
of war to wait for ransom, but they were the ones being hunted
Move forward!
relentlessly without rest for 9 dark days and nights across a vast plain, with no way out until the last man fell in utter despair. This wasn't just an ordinary battle. This was the fateful moment when all of Europe was shocked and shaken to realize nightmares don't just exist in creepy midnight legends. The real nightmare is here right before their eyes. It is riding on horseback, carrying the arrows of death and coming from the east with the speed of a storm. Welcome to the Battle of the Kalka River, the first Mongol massacre at the gateway to Europe. Today we will deconstruct one of the darkest and most haunting pages of human history. Are you ready to witness the start of a reign of terror? Let's get started. In the 13th century, while European kingdoms were preoccupied with distant crusades or lost in cycles of fighting over petty territories in the east, a massive shadow was quietly cloaking the horizon, swallowing every light of a fake peace. That wasn't just an empire by the traditional definition, but a perfect war machine, operated by the iron will of Genghis Khan, the man who turned scattered nomadic tribes into a whirlwind that swept away all barriers. That power was fast as lightning on the plains, quiet as the night creeping into the enemy's sleep, and as brutal as an irreversible fate after crushing the proud Khwarezmia and leveling the prosperous cities of Central Asia to ash. Genghis Khan set his sights on the burning sunset and ordered his 2 most formidable and loyal hounds, Subutai and Jeeb. They didn't bring clunky supply trains or slow infantry. Accompanying them were only 20,000 elite cavalry archers who could shoot through armor gaps while at a full gallop, and war horses that could go without food or water for days. Their mission wasn't to capture and hold fortified citadels, but to conduct the greatest reconnaissance mission in human history. They pushed forward to measure the strength of the Western world, to test the courage of the Steel Knights, and to redraw the world map with human blood and horse blood. Under the command of tactical master Subutai and the divine arrow Jeeb, that army marched through eternal snow-capped mountains, across vast steppes that Westerners had never heard of. Wherever they went, the thundering sound of their hooves echoed like an apocalypse warning, making even the proudest dynasties tremble when they realized their walls were nothing but piles of rubble against the god-tier flexibility of the Mongol army. They didn't come turning lush green fields into nameless graveyards and preparing for a full-scale invasion that would forever change the course of human history. Every step of these 20,000 cavalrymen was a knife cutting into the faith of European lords, proving that the darkness from the east didn't just come to watch, but to swallow everything as Mongol hooves stepped onto the western steppes, shattering ancient silence with the rumble of fate. They encountered the Kipchaks. Would you like me to continue translating the next part of the script? Notoriously aggressive and ruthless, yet in the face of a Subutai, as cunning as an old fox and as brutal as a starving tiger, those proud Kipchak warriors knew only one thing: to survive. Run. They fled for their lives toward the ancient Rus principalities, carrying an utter terror that spread like a plague. They knelt at the feet of the Grand Princes, breathless and with bloodshot eyes, begging in despair. Today they take our land, tomorrow they will take your heads. Demons without human faces are coming from the rising sun. That warning was initially met with only arrogant smirks. However, under the pressure of a common enemy, a massive alliance unprecedented in the history of the Rurik dynasty was formed. Illustrious Rus princes gathered from Mstislav, the Bold of Galicia, with his invincible sword to Mstislav of Kiev with his supreme authority. Under their command were tens of thousands of soldiers in shining chainmail proud heavy cavalry on the backs of massive warhorses looking like mobile steel walls. They looked at their overwhelming numbers, looked at the forest of bristling spears covering the entire field, then looked over at the trembling Kipchak remnants and mocked, what's so scary about those eastern savages? We have the numbers, we have righteousness, and we have steel walls that no arrow can pierce. They entered the battle with the mindset of hunters strolling through their own territory, eager to crush the short nomadic troops who were feigning flight before them, not knowing that every bit of chaos and retreat from the Mongols was a perfect performance, orchestrated by the master intellect of Subutai. In the eyes of that old general, those vast Rus lines weren't opponents, but merely innocent prey, walking right into a death trap on the banks of the Kalka River. Subutai watched silently from afar, a cold smile on his lips, as he saw the Rus alliance start to fall apart due to arrogance and bickering over glory. Even while on the march, he wasn't just attacking their bodies, but playing with their souls, pulling them deeper into the plains with no way out, where the courage of knights would become meaningless against rains of arrows that blackened the sky. As soon as they saw the massive and illustrious figure of the Rus alliance, the Mongols suddenly did something that made all the Western commanders turn from bewilderment to contempt. They turned and ran for their lives. Chaotic hoofbeats and clouds of dust rose from small groups, retreating like truly defeated men. Day after day, the Russians gave chase with burning enthusiasm, while the Mongols patiently retreated, keeping just enough distance so the prey would never lose the trail but could never reach them. The breathless chase stretched across endless grasslands where every mile passed was a step closer to fate's gallows. By the third day, the initial intense excitement of the Russian army began to give way to utter exhaustion. Heavy chainmail under the dry steppe sun became a massive burden. The victory shouts grew thin, replaced by gasps for air, and suspicion began to spark in the eyes of the poor infantrymen. By the sixth day, the Rus alliance rose began to crack seriously from within. The inherent arrogance of the princes had flared into a race for selfish glory. Mstislav the Bold and the noble knights, wanting to be the first to plant the victory flag on the enemy's back, ignored unified orders and spurred their horses madly forward. They left the slow infantry and the supply train far behind, turning themselves into an arrow leaving the bow, but with no clear destination. On the ninth day, the once mighty Rus alliance was no longer a unified army. It was merely a tattered ribbon, stretching for dozens of miles across the vast plain. Hunger tore at their guts, exhaustion blurred their vision, and a total loss of direction had turned those proud warriors into soulless husks. Walking unconsciously, discipline was dead, leaving only the chaos of scattered fragments. And that was exactly the moment Subutai had been waiting for. By the quiet Kalka River, where the water seemed to hold its breath, witnessing history, the old general lightly tightened the reins, signaling his retreating army to halt. He calmly drew his razor-sharp curved blade from its scabbard, the cold steel reflecting the sharp eyes of an alpha wolf that had backed its prey into a corner. The game of cat and mouse ended in a heartbeat. Those who were fleeing suddenly whipped around, forming ranks with a bone-chilling precision. Horns blared loudly, tearing through the silence of the steppe from both flanks. The Mongol units that had been lying in ambush all this time suddenly appeared, like ghosts from the earth surrounding the scattered Russian groups. There was no mercy, no heroic declarations of war, only rains of black arrows pouring down like a waterfall, starting the most horrific massacre the land of the Rus had ever suffered. The Battle of Kalka wasn't a heroic hand-to-hand clash between face-to-face warriors where courage could turn the tide. It was a mass execution, planned with bone-chilling meticulousness as soon as the order from Subutai rang out. The Mongols whipped around like a beast that had toyed with its prey long enough and began bearing its fangs rains of arrows from horse archers. Deadly weapons with horrific range and penetrating power poured onto the Russian army like a thick flood, so dense it blocked out the sun. The Rus were in utter panic. Exhausted infantrymen, before they could even collect their thoughts, saw comrades falling in heaps. They tried to scream to re-establish defensive shield formations, but it was all too late. Mongol cavalry moved across the steppe like ghosts, appearing and disappearing with unbelievable speed. They would strike the weakest points head-on, then immediately retreat as bait when the opponent counterattacked, and then suddenly surround them from behind in deadly arcs. In the heart of the storm of destruction, the arrogance of the Rus princes had turned into a death sentence for themselves. There was no coordination, no unified command at all. Instead of standing together against the enemy, the Rus princes continued to argue and blame each other right in the middle of the rain of arrows, each holing up in a separate corner of the battlefield. The blood of Slavic warriors dyed the Kalka red, turning the clear blue water into a thick stream of death.
Help us! They are attacking!
Russian soldiers, once proud of their shining armor and oaths of honor, now threw away their weapons and their dignity to run for their lives into the vast emptiness of the steppe. But on this flat land, there was no place for the weak to hide. Mongol horses were more resilient, and faster than death itself they glided over the ground, carried calm riders swinging blades and harvesting lives like ripe grain, and so one by one the units were swallowed in the massive encirclement. Cries for help were drowned out by the thundering hooves and the constant snap of bowstrings. There was no mercy for the defeated, and absolutely no way out for those who dared underestimate the darkness from the east. The Battle of Kalka ended not just with a military victory, but with a bloody message sent to all of Europe. A new world order had formed, and it was written by the sword of the Mongols. In the aftermath of the horrific battle, the remnants of the defeated were despair. A group of Rus princes, led by Mstislav of Kiev, finally accepted laying down their arms to surrender after receiving a word of honor from the enemy that not a single drop of your blood shall be spilled upon this land. In the world of Western Knights, that was a commitment to life and respect for noble prisoners of war. But the Mongols kept their word in the most brutal and haunting way that human imagination could conceive. For Subutai, a promise wasn't an act of mercy, but a symbolic calculation of punishment. They ordered a massive pit to be dug right on the battlefield, still thick with the stench of death, forcing the most powerful princes to lie down like mindless objects. Then thick and heavy wooden planks were stacked over their bodies, creating a crude platform right on top of those planks. Amidst the wind howling across the vast steppe, the Mongol commanders nonchalantly set their banquet tables. They drank fermented mare milk, sang at the top of their lungs, and danced, celebrating their glorious victory. Beneath paths with the Mongols, wooden layer of living hell was unfolding in silence. The bones of the Rus princes shattered bit by bit under the crushing weight of the feast. Above every rhythm of the dance, every burst of laughter from the victors was another squeeze to their chests, stripping away the last bit of oxygen. They weren't beheaded, they weren't stabbed to death. They died slowly of suffocation, internal injuries, and the sheer humiliation of having the enemy trample over their lives to enjoy the glory. True to the promise, not a single drop of blood spilled onto the ground, behind hollowed lives of the Rus elite were completely crushed. It was a cold and brutal message sent to a trembling Europe. Never use numbers to challenge the will of Genghis Khan, and never cross to keep your own life and your subjects. The ghosts of the Kalka River became the first bitter lesson, signaling an era where Mongol hoofs would level even the proudest dynasties. The Battle of the Kalka River, with all its bloodshed and cruelty, was actually just a Large-scale scouting mission in the eyes of the Mongol military after wiping out the strongest army in the region and leaving behind a broken and exhausted Rus land. Subutai quietly ordered the withdrawal. That ghost cavalry retreated toward the east, vanishing behind the vast horizon as if they had never appeared. And widows wailing by the death-filled river. Europe at that time, from the proud castles in Poland to the distant kingdom of Hungary, breathed a sigh of relief. They deluded themselves into thinking it was just a random disaster, a freak sandstorm from the desert that suddenly struck and then faded. The surviving princes went back to their petty power struggles, and the knights returned to their flashy rituals, believing the savages had fled out of fear for Western faith and strength. But they were wrong, fatal mistake. The Mongols never give up. They were only preparing 15 years after. The generation of young Rus soldiers had barely forgotten the pain of their fathers. That shadow returned, this time not as 20,000 scouting cavalry, but as a massive army led by Batu, with Subutai acting as the architect of destruction. This time, not to scout, but to conquer. This time no alliance was strong enough to stop them because arrogance had blinded those in power. Even the most fortified cities collapsed, like sandcastles before the steppe. Hove's history never forgets its harsh lessons, but humans always tend to forget when fake peace clouds their judgment, and the price of forgetting is always paid. Paid with rivers of blood, the ashes of civilizations, and the clanking chains of slaves. Mongol hooves did not just trample land, they crushed the complacency of an entire continent, leaving a scar that would never heal in the soul of humanity. History itself never forgets. It is only humans who frequently forget it, and the price of forgetting is always paid with rivers of blood and the ashes of civilizations that once considered themselves eternal. What Subutai and Jeeb left behind on the Rus steppe was not just corpses, but a psychological ghost haunting the entire old continent for centuries to follow. Feast upon human remains at the Kalka River, or are amazed by the timeless military genius of the steppe. Warriors, hit like and subscribe right now. The world of Genghis Khan still holds terrifying corners and unbelievable achievements. Do you want to hear about the greatest campaign of revenge in history, where a prosperous kingdom was wiped off the map over a single insult? Or do you want to learn the secret behind the military genius of Subutai, the man who single-handedly led armies to conquer 32 nations, defeating millions of enemies without ever tasting defeat? Leave a comment below with the topic you crave to explore the most. I will turn those bloody pages of history into vivid films just for you. Don't let history be forgotten, because the darkness from the east may still be waiting somewhere beyond the horizon.